Good afternoon. It's a signal pleasure for me to stand on a podium in Berlin to talk about George Mosse, since he is largely responsible for my being here. I studied with George at UW-Madison in the early 1970s. He drew me to the study of history, especially German history and German Jewish history, albeit along a wayward path through Hebrew and German literature. Typical of George, when I started graduate school in comparative literature, he blurted out that comparative literature is not a discipline. He was my mentor when I was a graduate student in history at Berkeley. He came to Berkeley regularly to visit his stepmother, and he made sure that we met. When I told him that I wanted to write a dissertation about German Jewish history in the first half of the 19th century, he advised me to read sermons and journals and to analyze the concept of Bildung. We remained in touch for the rest of his life, and at every stage of my itinerant academic career, whether in Jerusalem, Berkeley, Oxford, and then again Madison. My scholarly work has been a dialogue with George, though perhaps as much on the page as in person. I was always in awe of George. I first encountered him when he was lecturing to hundreds of students in the Humanities building at Madison. His turbocharged lecture voice, not to mention his mischievous pedagogy of smashing all idols, was seared in my brain to the extent that whenever I would lecture, or should I say attempt to lecture to undergraduates, I would hear his booming voice. I was painfully aware that I could never be the mass educator that he was. Now for the subject at hand, George on Jewish emancipation. George viewed emancipation from within. He understood its achievements and failings, promises and limits, through the history of his own family and the Berlin Jewry of which they were such prominent members and which we heard about yesterday. He, of course, knew full well the history of emancipation, Jewish emancipation in other countries. The lecture course on European Jewish history that he began to offer in 1971 was a pioneering step towards a Jewish studies curriculum at UW-Madison. Nevertheless, his focus and chief concern was Germany. George was sensitive to the ways in which the inordinate emphasis on emancipation had constricted interpretations of German Jewish history, especially after Nazism and the Holocaust. In 1967, in Germans and Jews, the Right, the Left, and the Search for a Third Force, he wrote, I quote, "German Jewish history has usually been described either as the failure of emancipation or as the story of a separate people living on German soil. The former reads history backwards. The latter applies to German history, a criterion taken from the quite different history of East European Jewry." Perhaps his fullest account of emancipation appeared in the Crisis of German Ideology in 1964. I quote again, "Before 1812, Jews had been treated as a separate group on German soil, and while they were permitted to carry on their business activities under special privileges, they had to pay special taxes for the honor. But even after 1812, professorial chairs were barred to Jewish intellectuals, and no Jews could become an officer in the army. With the fall of Napoleon, the German states hurried to impose restrictions upon their Jews once more, and it took the Revolution of 1848 to proclaim a fuller emancipation. Jewish emancipation was not really consummated until 1918. Emancipation became bound up in the end with both the advance of liberalism and the existence of the Weimar Republic. In this telescoped account, he dealt exclusively with Prussia. He juxtaposed disabilities that emerged in the Vormärz, professorial chairs, with those in Wilhelmine Germany, reserve army officers, and leapt from 1848 to 1918. This bare, if evocative outline sufficed for George because he never conceived of emancipation as a topic in its own right. He was not concerned with the details of the process. Emancipation was always a point of departure to his primary concern, namely its political and cultural ramifications. Emancipation was foundational for George's overall understanding of German Jewish history. Its nature and timing had fundamentally shaped German Jewry's culture and politics. As I heard him say at the Clark University conference in 1984, quote, "The history of German Jews was largely determined by the process of emancipation. Jews were emancipated into the autumn of the Enlightenment, when the ideals of rationalism, pragmatism, and tolerance still retained their appeal." Or as he elaborated the idea in German Jews Beyond Judaism, quote, "Jews were emancipated into a bourgeoisie which needed the concept of Bildung for its own ends. It became an article of faith, a striving toward greater things as an integral part of bourgeois existence. With the passage of time, Bildung was transformed into a kind of religion." End of quote. The significant consequence of this idealization of the concept of self-cultivation, and George's signature argument was that, quote, "It is from the mountain of classical Bildung that these German Jewish intellectuals descended and presented an attractive definition of Jewishness beyond religion and nationalism." When George propounded this novel iconoclastic argument in the 1980s, it was truly subversive. I remember the shocked reactions when he lectured at the Association of Jewish Studies conference. I hardly need add that today it has only gained in relevance. It stands as an admonition to an increasingly militant, reactionary, and indeed messianic Judaism linked to a chauvinist, anti-democratic ethno-nationalism. As we all know, George was an engaged public intellectual. He fervently believed that history informed and fashioned the present, as evident in one of his favorite maxims, "What man is, only history tells." In this instance, he was truly prophetic. In contrast to George, I want to focus on emancipation as a proper subject and to do so comparatively. I want to consider its political and legal history. This alternative approach, moreover, confirms George's main contention. I turn to emancipation in Germany with the caveat that I want to avoid reviving the venerable idea that Germany or Central Europe was either the model for emancipation or its epicenter. Malachi HaKohen has offered a refurbished version of this practice in his recently published monumental Jacob and Esau, Jewish European History Between Nation and Empire. I quote, "German-speaking Central Europe was the battleground of emancipation and anti-Semitism, the cradle of Jewish pluralism, and the sphere where Jews were confronted with competing options of nation-state and empire, represented by Germany and Austria-Hungary, respectively, hence its preeminence in this book. I investigate emancipation not to invest the German states or Wilhelmine Germany with representative or exemplary status, but rather to highlight emancipation's specific characteristics. A first general observation. Contrary to the conventional view, emancipation did not begin with the Enlightenment or the French Revolution and conclude in 1870 or 1917 or 1921-22. Emancipation was neither one time and chronologically discrete, nor a linear event. It started earlier, was recurring, and continues to this day. For example, in Italy, Jews gained emancipation 5 times, between 1796 and 1799, in 1801, in 1848, in 1870, and in 1944, and lost it 4 times, in 1800, between 1813 and 1815, in 1848, and in 1938. In France, Jews gained emancipation 6 times, in 1790, in 1791, in 1818, in 1870, in 1944, and in 1961, and lost it twice, in 1808 and in 1940. In the German states, they attained rights 4 times, between 1800 and 1813, in 1848, in 1870, and in 1945, and lost it 3 times, in 1815, in 1848, and between 1933 and 1941. We cannot define emancipation without including the developments of the 16th to the 18th centuries. From 1550, Jews in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and some Italian city-states and cities along the Atlantic seaboard, such as Bordeaux and Hamburg, began to gain extensive privileges bordering on parity with Christian merchants and burghers. In some cases, there was later a direct transition from privileges to rights. In the 17th century, Jews in Amsterdam and London began to gain civil rights in nascent civil societies. Emancipation did not end in 1870 or 1917 or 1945. Although the minority rights treaties that emerged from the wreckage of World War I guaranteed Jews citizenship, the successor states to Austria-Hungary infringed those rights in the interwar period. The Nazis put the abrogation of emancipation front and center. Regaining citizenship in Europe after World War II entailed the restoration of rights, the restitution of property, and the negotiation of reparations. Issues of property and reparations are still in play, and in fact, the project to gain restitution for the Mosse art collection is part of the ongoing history of emancipation. If we consider the longue durée of modern Jewish history, then it is obvious that emancipation was the principal event. The Holocaust and the establishment of the State of Israel were reactions to it, in philosophical parlance, epiphenomena. The process of emancipation continues into the 21st century. Jews everywhere live in the era of emancipation. The chief challenge remains the attainment and maintenance of equality. A second observation. Europe had 3 regions of emancipation: Western, Central, and Eastern Europe. The East-West binary is an insidious ideological construct, not a tool of historical analysis. Western Europe. In Holland, England, and southern France, Jews gained civil rights through the circumstances of settlement. Jews had to mobilize only for political rights. The struggle for rights was, although intense, relatively brief, although in France various issues lingered. Napoleon's infamous decree until 1818, rabbis' salaries until 1831, the Moreh Judaica oath until 1846, and the entire process recapitulated itself in Algeria from 1830 to 1870. Central Europe. From the 16th to 18th centuries, the German states and Habsburg Empire had enacted Jewry laws that imposed an inferior legal status, relegating Jews to the margins of corporate society and granting privileges according to their ascribed utility. The struggle for rights was broad in scope, encompassing both civil and political rights, and prolonged, lasting for most of a century. Central European states granted conditional or partial emancipation, making additional rights contingent upon regeneration, understood through the ideal of Bildung, the restructuring of occupations, education, and communal and religious life to promote utility to the state. The state legislated and supervised that regeneration. Eastern Europe. As in Central Europe, the struggle for rights in Tsarist Russia and Congress Poland was broad in scope, encompassing civil and political rights, and prolonged, lasting for over a century. It also involved far more Jews. Sheer numbers were a significant factor. Russian legislation followed Central European models of conditional emancipation that made rights contingent upon regeneration, yet emphasized sticks, coercion, over carrots, incentives. Moreover, in contrast to Western and Central Europe, Jews first gained political rights in Congress Poland in 1861, in Russia in 1905, and then civil rights. Now to emancipation in the German states and Germany. Their emancipation, beyond being a state-supervised process of regeneration, had two additional distinguishing characteristics. First, in France, Jews were emancipated out of estates. The French Revolution extricated Jews from estate structures as part of its general dismantling of estates. In contrast, the German states granted rights by moving Jews both into and out of estates, since their estate structures persisted. Joseph II inaugurated this ambiguous policy. His Edict of Toleration of 1781 made some Jews eligible to gain the estate-specific privileges of guilds. At the same time, he moved Jews collectively out of estates by abolishing their collective privileges or autonomy. Beginning in the Napoleonic period, for example, Baden and Bavaria promulgated partial emancipation that mixed into with out of estates. Baden and Bavaria would continue that pattern until unification. Prussia's 1812 edict had abolished the Jews' corporate status. Frederick Wilhelm IV, an advocate of the Christian state, attempted to reimpose corporate status, so-called Judenschaften, beginning in 1841. Although he failed in the face of serious opposition, his 1847 law excluded Jews from the Christian state by omitting any mention of citizenship. The law excluded Jews from all state positions involving, quote, judicial, policing, or executive authority. It permitted them to teach technical subjects, such as medicine, mathematics, and natural science, at all ranks at universities and technical schools, while prohibiting posts in all culturally sensitive subjects, such as philosophy, philology, and classics. Second, the persistence of estates gave rise to the dualism of local citizenship, Ortsbürgerschaft or Heimatrecht, versus state citizenship, Staatsbürgerrecht. Baden's constitutional edict of June 14, 1808, recognized Jews as state citizens, but not as local citizens, until they had an occupation and livelihood equivalent to Christians. Jews therefore lacked the all-important right of residence, which adhered to local citizenship. The edict prohibited residence in areas that hitherto had excluded Jews. Bavaria's edict of June 10, 1813, allowed only Jews who already possessed a local right of residence, so-called Indigenat, to acquire, quote, civic rights and privileges. Moreover, the number of Jews in local communities was to remain static or diminish. Local rights thus limited state rights. The most draconian provision limited permission to marry to the quota set by each community's Jewish list in the so-called Judenmatrikel. The edict opened all occupations to Jews, including the guilds, thus transferring some into estates. The dualism of local and state citizenship, in its various permutations, remained in place until unification. Yet the now unified German Empire introduced a new dualism, the federal constitution versus state law. That dualism left aspects of the Jews' status in contention and inherited forms of discrimination in place. It meant Wilhelmine Germany was as fragmented and multiform as the emancipation process and unification. For example, after unification, in defiance of the federal constitution, Prussia continued to exclude Jews from positions in the judiciary and the army, schools, and universities. As Peter Pulzer has written, quote, Prussia was de facto a Christian state. The dualism of federal and state law came to the fore in respect to naturalization and admission to citizenship. The federal constitution established criteria for naturalization and citizenship that the individual states applied. In 1890, the Prussian Ministry of Interior informed regional administrators that, quote, the naturalization of Polish Jews is to be rejected in conformity with the existing policy, close quote. The standard phrase bureaucrats employed was that, quote, the the naturalization of foreigners of the Mosaic religion is in itself inadmissible. Bavaria maintained various forms of administrative inequality. Jews faced obstacles in receiving state appointments. Bavaria's naturalization policies, beginning in May 1871, generally excluded Russian and Galician Jews. As one ministerial official put it, quote, "Russian Jews are normally not naturalized." The Weimar Republic's full emancipation dismantled Wilhelmine Germany's dualism. Nazi Germany created a new dualism based on race. The law for the restoration of the professional civil service overturned Jews' access to the civil service. The two Nuremberg laws excluded them from the franchise. The Reich Citizenship Law, Reichsbürgergesetz of September 15, 1935, denied Jews the status of citizen by distinguishing between the Aryan Reich citizen, Reichsbürger, who possessed full citizenship, including political rights, and the newly invented inferior status of the non-Aryan state member, Staatsangehörige. In conclusion, treating emancipation as a proper subject underscores its singular characteristics and continuities in the various Germanies. It was these dualisms that created the historical configuration whose consequences George so brilliantly traced. His reconstruction of a Jewishness beyond religion and nationalism continues to cast a beam of radiant light onto our era, one that now seems intent on rushing headlong into darkness. Thank you.